Okay, hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Kitty Stewart. I'm Professor of Social Policy and Associate Director of the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion here at LSE. And I'm really pleased, honoured, in fact, to be chairing this really special event today, hosted by the Department of Social Policy. The launch of Professor Hartley Dean's new book, Sociality, which I have a copy of here, a much less beautiful copy because it's a hardback than the very pretty ones on sale at the back of the room, which are the paperbacks. So the plan for the evening is that we'll be here for an hour to an hour and a half discussing the book. So we're going to hear from Hartley and then from our panel who I'll introduce. And we've then got the opportunity at the end to buy a book, maybe get it signed by Hartley, perhaps.
Well, I won't be holding court.
Okay, but if you can find him, intercept him, he will sign it for you.
I don't imagine that the signature will add much value, but if
I'm sure it will.
Signature,
in lots of ways.
Catch me.
And there'll also be a reception, so do stick around at the end for that. So let me introduce then our panel. Hartley probably needs no introduction, but he's Emeritus Professor of Social Policy at the LSE. He's very much missed in our department, so it's particularly lovely to have him back here this evening and to see in the audience former students as well as colleagues, as well as current students in social policy, among others. Oh, and I should also welcome in particular Hartley's family. It's really, really lovely to have you here too today. Hartley spent 12 years as a welfare rights advisor in Brixton, South London, before starting a really rich and productive career in academia, researching, teaching and writing about social justice issues. And of course, he's going to be introducing his new book, Sociality, which is in some senses a second edition of his 2015 book, Social Rights and Human Welfare, but radically revised. It develops a concept of sociality as a holistic way of understanding how we as humans have come to care about and collectively provide for our welfare as a species and to recognise each other's needs in terms of shared social rights. Hartley says in the introduction that it tells not so much a success story as a hopeful story. And I think we certainly need hopeful stories right now. After Hartley has presented the book, we're going to be hearing from our two excellent respondents, Tanya Burkhardt, who is Associate Director of Case and Associate Professor in Social Policy. She's the author of an extensive body of work exploring theories of justice, including the capability approach. And most recently, and most pertinently to tonight's topic, she's been thinking and writing about social care. Nikki Cato has a long history of work in frontline welfare rights. She's former chair trustee of Brixton Advice Centre, and she's a freelance author, writer, and community engagement consultant. So it's really, really great to have you both here to respond. Hartley, over to you.
Can I first check that people can hear me? Because I've no idea, because I don't know how much my previous conversation you've been over here. First of all, thank you all for coming. I'm amazed to see so many people here. And thank you to Kitty. Thank you to the department for sponsoring this event. And most particularly to Maria for organizing this so wonderfully. The aim, of course, is to introduce my book, which is in part, as Kitty's just been saying, a 10th anniversary edition of Social Rights and Human Welfare, but which with a new central narrative and main title, Sociality. While I shall briefly outline the content of the book, I want principally to focus on this term, sociality, and on what it means for the reconceptualization of social rights as a cornerstone concept in social policy, something requiring a fundamental shift in perception. But for various reasons, I should like us this evening to go beyond the conclusions offered in the book to reflect on what those conclusions might more specifically entail in relation to the practical policy context when it comes by way of two examples. First, to the conceptualization of care on the one hand, and secondly, to the realities of welfare rights practice. My reasons are in part personal. First of all, some of you here will already be aware that I've recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. The symptoms at present are quite subtle, but can affect my oral communication, which is why I am actually reading this, unfortunately, since rather than busking it. However, knowing what this diagnosis portends for the future does rather focus the mind on what we might be a right to social care. Secondly, I have lately become especially mindful that this particular book might be regarded as the culmination of a 40-year intellectual journey in which I've been trying to make sense of the 12 years that I previously spent as a welfare rights worker, struggling and substantially failing, I feel, to realize the social rights of a diverse and systemically disadvantaged inner London community. Tanya and Nikki, respectively, are here, I hope, to carry those conversations forward. But for now, let's start with the book. The stuff we're going to focus on is largely to be found in chapters 1 and 11. There is, however, a substantial filling sandwiched between those chapters. Part 1 of the sandwich is concerned with established theories to do with the social rights of citizenship, with human need and human rights, with social rights and social development, with ethics, ideologies, and sociality, and with established critiques of social rights. Part 2 is more concerned with social rights in practice, with rights to human services, health, education, social care, housing, with rights to livelihood, to subsistence and work, with social rights in global context, and finally with rights of redress and the relationship between social rights and the law. To talk about all of that would obviously be exhausting, but if people should want to draw me back to particular themes before the evening is out, then, certainly I'd be delighted. But I'm talking for the moment about sociality, and I apologize to those of you who may have heard bits of this somewhere before. Sociality is not a new concept, and though I may be seeking to extend its meaning, I should make clear I haven't just made it up. Its origins are largely philosophical, and so many roads here lead to the stony-faced Aristotle. It's been said that sociality is a synonym for Aristotle's term zoon politikon. And though classical scholars might quibble, my understanding is that his intention was to characterize the human being as a social animal, as much as a political animal in the modern sense. But the actual word sociality may have originated some 2,000 years later with one Hugo Grotius. Now, faintly reminiscent in appearance to the fictional Lord Edmund Blackadder, he was in fact an early 17th century Dutch jurist imprisoned for his heretical thinking and who, by means of a cunning plan, escaped to France and published a humongous thesis on the law of war and peace. And part of his argument was that human beings should be governed on the understanding that they are subject to competing drives for individual survival on the one hand and for sociality on the other. His point was that these two drives are interdependent. So let's jump forward in history to Karl Marx. I was reminded, incidentally, the other day that back in 1970, someone put a bomb under Marx's tomb in Highgate Cemetery. But the tomb survived undamaged, albeit that thereafter it did lean a little further to the left. Marx, whether celebrated or reviled for his revolutionary goals and political economic critique, was a significant philosophical and anthropological thinker. Those elements of his work have lately been re-examined by a Hungarian philosopher, György Marcus, whose picture is up there. Now, György Marcus, who died as recently as 2016, has reworked elements of that thinking, and it's his working which has informed my own thinking and shaped the concept of sociality with which I am working. Central to the argument, contra Hegel, is a material rather than a spiritual understanding of the human essence. Marx appears to have identified 4 essential and distinctive characteristics of the human species that sets it apart from others, and which define our species being, of which sociality is one such feature. The others are consciousness, work, and historical development. The 4 are mutually interdependent, and in a sense, none can be understood except in the context of the others. Books have and will be written on the others, but the compelling quality of the Marx/Marcus conception is that what distinguishes the human species in nature is the combination and interaction of these characteristics. Human consciousness is shaped through a shared cognitive awareness. By work, Marx was alluding to all forms of productive or creative human activity. In other words, our uniquely purposive and collaborative metabolism with nature. And most famously, Marx contended that humans have the capacity to change their world, to make history. Sociality, then, is central to human identity and self-awareness. And it would be good to turn for a moment from talking about pronouncements of white men and consider philosophies espoused by non-white and non-male thinkers. Consider, for example, the ancient Pan-African philosophy, Ubuntu, and its aphorism, "A person is a person through other persons." On the screen is the Zulu version, but alternatives are available in Xhosa and other African languages. That aphorism, fundamental in its nature, resonates with a statement from Hannah Arendt, who, though a fierce critic, it must be said, of Marx, clearly appropriated some of his philosophical thinking, not least when she asserted that a life not lived among other humans is not a human life. But the concept also has relevance and meaning in the world of science and scientists. Looking a bit like a grumpy Father Christmas, Charles Darwin observed the existence of other animals that appear to exhibit what he called social sympathies and to take pleasure in society with others. But he contended that human beings are unique in nature in exhibiting, not natural instincts attributable to natural selection, but social instincts, culturally conveyed from generation to generation. Only humans, using his words, may be regarded as moral beings. Darwin was actually a contemporary of Marx, and they are known to have been aware of each other's work. At a pinch, it could be argued that for Darwin's social instincts, we could read Sociality. And with some prescience, Darwin declared, and I'm more or less quoting him here, that as humanity advances in civilization and small tribes are united into larger communities, the simplest reason would tell we ought to extend our social instincts and sympathies to all the members of the same nation, though personally unknown to us. This point being once reached, there is only an artificial barrier to prevent our sympathies extending to persons of all nations and races. Now, we'll come back to that. Next up is an actually living person now, Michael Tomasello, who has introduced us to the concept of ontogenetic sociality. He argues, in opposition to the controversial biologist Richard Dawkins, that we are not genetically wired to be selfish, but have genetically evolved in ways that enable us, as in life we mature, to become helpful, cooperative, group-minded, morally responsible. Now, we might legitimately ask, how is it then that human species has turned out to be as violent and as self-destructive as indeed it has? Why is human history so disfigured by acts of genocide, systematic cruelty, oppression, mutual exploitation? Why are we so capable of dehumanizing ourselves? Why is our sociality not more consistently apparent? Why is the self-evidence of our social interdependency not more widely acknowledged? Now, I've tried in the book and elsewhere to suggest an explanation of the ways in which sociality may be concealed. We can say, for example, well, we all depend on each other, but such a statement may be dismissed as meaninglessly naive. In fact, the paradox of its apparent banality arises precisely because the mechanisms that conceal its truth can be subtle and complex. And here I want to talk about the widely misunderstood concept of fetishism. The original concept can be attributed to an 18th century autodidact with, by all accounts, a rather splendid hairdo. Charles de Brosse applied this concept of sociality in an anthropological study, a study of fetish gods in West Africa. The concept has since fallen in and out of fashion, not just amongst anthropologists, but also amongst philosophers, political economists, and more recently, psychoanalysts. They've all picked it up and worked with it for a bit. And there isn't a simple definition. So this is my own best effort at a definition. A fetish can be a symbolic object, a cultural construct, or a moral ideal that obscures the perception of human relationships. Fetishized perceptions may be implicated in unseen mechanisms of cultural transmission so that social realities may never be seen for what they are. Nevertheless, when we are not fighting one another or wrecking the planet upon whose resources we depend, human beings have managed to look after one another in ways that may be more or less compassionate and effective. Sociality has been manifested in various ways, but our perceptions of it have been consistently obscured or distorted. Fetish concept may be applied in the significance of gift-giving in pre-modern tribal societies, by which imminent social functions appear to have been sustained through beliefs in the spiritual or magical properties ascribed to the goods and favors exchanged in everyday life. A phenomenon which, incidentally, the LSE's Richard Titmuss was aware if you read The Gift Relationship. The notion of fetishism can also be applied as a way of interpreting the pedagogic functions entailed in later religions. All or most world religions espouse some version of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have done unto you, and by divine ordinance or injunction, they promote the virtue of charity and good deeds as cloaked expressions of sociality. Psychoanalytic theories suggest that our forbidden or unachievable desires may be displaced through fetishized behaviors or attachment. Marx, who we happen to know was aware of de Brosse's work, he drew on the concept of fetishism by pointing to the illusory powers vested in the state and the market, and the illusory value vested in money and commodities. Famously, Marx used the metaphor of the camera obscura when claiming that capitalism turns commonly shared perceptions of the world upside down. And my contention is that at the level of popular and political discourse alike, it is the fetishized construction of the sovereign individual that obscures or distorts the perception of sociality, that constructs an upside down conception of freedom and autonomy, so denying the realization of the human species' essential interdependency, so frustrating the social freedoms and self-realization that interdependency makes possible. So how can any of this lead to a reconceptualization of social rights? To be clear, if anyone isn't sure, but that by social rights, or what are often called welfare rights, what we're talking about a range of rights that they may depend yet rely upon civil and political rights, and rights which include critical aspects of what's sometimes called economic rights or cultural rights. But these are importantly rights to health and social care, to social security, to housing and environmental protection, to education and employment, to all the things that are essential for human beings to be critically conscious, creatively active, to be participants in human history. The orthodox theory of social rights in academic social policy is attributable largely to one T.H. Marshall, a former head of department here at the LSE. He portrayed social rights as the creation of the 20th century democratic capitalist welfare state. In fact, however, an expression of social rights could already be found within the UN's Declaration of Human Rights, albeit that at an international level, they were and largely remain in such a form as to be, in direct terms at least, largely unenforceable. In its original edition, Social Rights and Human Welfare, there I argued for a post-Marshallian conception of social rights. And I suggested that they be redefined as articulations of human need, articulations that have throughout history been negotiated in a multiplicity of ways, long before even the invention of the welfare state, and indeed before the development of a language of rights. But in this new edition, I take that argument further and contend that social rights may be regarded as a component of human sociality. Here, I draw in part on Axel Honneth's argument in his book, Struggle for Recognition. Sociality may be inferred to encompass three aspects: the love by which we sustain ourselves and achieve our self-identity within families and intimate relationships, the solidarity through which we express our being in cooperation with others within kinship groups and communities, but also rights, including specifically, and this is me, not Honneth speaking, social rights, rights constructed in relation to distant strangers, in recognition of shared human needs, rights mutually negotiated in recognition of the needs of others and all our own claims upon others, rights premised on recognition that reaches beyond Darwin's artificial boundaries, beyond divisions constructed between different communities, social groupings, and nations. So here, a classic psychological trick, familiar to many or most of you, I guess, an inanimate vase here, or two human faces. What I argue is required is a Gestalt switch, a switch in perception, a reframing of recognition and rights beyond illusions of individual or indeed national sovereignty, so as to embrace a fundamental form of what we might call species awareness. This is not a call to some kind of peace and love spiritual conversion, I think of John Lennon, or rather Yoko, they maybe had something when they suggested we should imagine there's no countries, no religion too. But this must be more than a spiritual reimagining. It's about our embodied, consciously active, history-making, and essentially social human being. In the concluding chapter of the book, I do toy in passing with the idea of methodological humanism, an approach premised on species awareness and the materiality of the human essence, but without, I feel, really joining the dots when I discussed it. The chapter does certainly touch, on the one hand, on the prospect of a denationalization of social rights, most urgently in relation to refugees. On the other, it touches on the potential for grassroots or sort of anarchistic insurgent citizenship initiatives by which local communities can assert their social rights. Each scenario might in its way transcend, on the one hand, the methodological individualism by which social rights are defined for and vested in individuals, and transcend, on the other, the methodological nationalism by which social rights are ultimately defined by and regulated for us as citizens of nation states. On these issues, I know I have more work to do. But in due course, when I come, as I must, to experience dementia, as around 70 million fellow human beings on the planet currently do, I should hope to be recognized and cared for as a human being, and that care should be unconditionally compassionate, not because it can be paid for or because I am a legitimate citizen of this country, because I am human. And because care is a definitive component of human sociality. So when I reflect back on my time spent back in the day working as a street-level welfare rights worker, I would wish that those who would succeed in my steps can achieve more than I did by connecting the daily struggles of the intersecting communities they serve with a realization, literally, of human sociality, by ensuring a realization of social rights that reflects mutual recognition of a central human need across those socially constructed boundaries and barriers. Now, I've said enough, and I'm looking forward now to hearing from Tanya and Nikki.
Thank you very much, Hartley. Tanya, over to you.
Thank you. Well, a very powerful presentation, Hartley, on the back of an extremely important book. And before I talk a little bit about how I see some of these ideas relating to an area of my interest in long-term care, adult social care, as you mentioned, Hartley, I just wanted to acknowledge my gratitude and debt to you throughout the time that I've known you as a fellow academic, for the way in which you open up and create space for these very fundamental discussions about the objectives of social policy. Too often, I find, myself very much included, we get absorbed in the detail of a particular policy struggle, policy area, working out whether this particular consultation paper that DWP have put out should be engaged with or not, or in what way, and so forth. And it's easy to go through the week, the month, and then the year and the decade without taking the time to remember why it is that we might be wanting to engage with social policy in the first place. And your philosophical approach, your ability to connect us back to the bigger picture is just incredibly valuable, I think. So thank you, and particularly for tonight's opportunity. One of the things that really came across very forcefully to me in the book and in what Hartley's just set out for us is the way in which we may think about and are encouraged to think about social rights as an extra if the economy, capital T, capital E, allows us the room to deliver on that agenda. I mean, that's very much, I think, the positioning that we have from the current government. We'll reform and improve healthcare, for example, when the economy allows us to make that spending. But this kind of gestalt switch that I think Hartley is encouraging us to make is to say, well, that's all really the wrong way round, and that the meeting of social rights is not a kind of extra. That's what's fundamentally human. That's the activity of living that we're all engaged in. And it's the economy that needs to serve the social rights, not the social rights that need to serve the economy. In the area I've been thinking about recently, adult social care, there's an organisation, or perhaps better to say a movement of people who have drawn on social care in their lives called Social Care Future. And I've been very impressed by the way that they've been working together, deliberating to try and articulate a new vision for what social care should look like, rather than the descriptions of adult social care as being perennially in crisis that we tend to hear about in policy debates and in the media. And the very simple formulation that Social Care Future have come up with is, we all want to live in the place we call home, with the people and things we love, in communities where we look out for each other, doing the things that matter to us. I very much doubt that many people in that movement have read Marx or even probably Hartley's book, although some of them may have done. But I think it's very striking how central that concept of sociality is in that formulation, which is entirely a kind of bottom-up, grounded in lived experience formulation of what this vision for social care should be. And it's particularly striking because, of course, you'll know that the idea of independent living has been absolutely central to the disabled people's movement for many decades. And what's happening here, I think, is that the idea of independent living is being recognised as requiring and being part of interdependence. And that where previously some parts of the disability movement perhaps had an individualistic understanding of what independent living meant, and that's led down a certain direction in policy terms, this reformulation is putting that interdependency absolutely centrally. It also very much points to and underlines the significance of relationships. And our own Jane Lewis and Anne West here in the Social Policy Department wrote a piece some years ago now, talking about how central relationships were, the relationship of care within long-term care, and yet how almost every aspect of the way that policy is actually delivers is mitigates against the sustaining of relationships, both relationships between family members who may be trying to provide care for a loved one who needs it, and relationships between professionals and the people they're caring for. For example, through extensive use of agencies that provide different care workers each time that somebody needs a visit, the reduction in the time allowed for people to visit, for example, to check on medication, all of which mitigates against a sustained relationship between the carer and the cared for. But there are some examples, innovations within long-term care, which have tried to put relationships absolutely central. And Kitty mentioned in her introduction that this is a hopeful book, and I think it behoves me to look at some of the positive examples, as well as bemoaning the general lack of attention to sociality within long-term care. So some of the positive examples. Hilary Cottam, who's a social entrepreneur, launched one of her books here a few years ago, in which she describes a social demonstration project called Circles, which recruited people over the age of 60, some of whom had more health needs and care needs than others, to provide mutual assistance. And what was important about these circles was that people recognized skills of many different kinds. So it might be that one person needed help with getting up in the morning, but somebody else wanted companionship. It might be that one person had DIY skills, somebody else loved playing dominoes, whatever it was, so that the exchange within the circle was a mutual recognition of the different skills and needs that people had within the group. And there's a very fascinating write-up of that experiment. In a different context, thinking about children who are described as on the margins of care or in care, the North Yorkshire County Council has developed the No Wrong Door scheme, which was at least partly developed through consultation with young people who are care experienced, who told the social workers that it was their relationships that mattered most to them. And again, that was both relationships, personal relationships with family members, with previous carers, and professional relationships, that the continual churning of social workers in a young person's life undermined their trust and their ability to make progress with their lives. So the No Wrong Door initiative has assigned a single key worker to each young person who follows them, whether they're in care or out of care, and indeed beyond care after they leave the care of the local authority, precisely in recognition of that centrality of the relationship. And it's also encouraged social workers to protect the existing relationships and networks of the young person. For example, avoiding out-of-area placements that tend to disrupt any existing relationships that the young person might have. So that's another positive example in a different context. And then finally, as a third example, is the Shared Lives initiative that some of you may know about, where an adult with a learning disability is matched with a family who have a spare space in their accommodation, in their flat or house, and for a period share their lives with the adult with learning disability. It's a kind of, if you like, adult fostering, although I don't think that term is liked by the participants. So these are all examples where services have been reimagined, putting relationships at the centre rather than regarding them as an obstacle or an irritation, an administrative inconvenience. Of course, they are just examples, isolated parts of good practice rather than something that's spread beyond into the system as a whole. And that brings me to the question that Hartley also raised in his presentation of, if this sociality is intrinsic to being human, why do we find it so difficult in practice? And I think my answer, very much consistent with what Hartley was saying, is that other things get in the way. So whether that's competition for scarce resources, whether it's the commodification of large parts of our lives, including leisure, including indeed relationships themselves, the commodification of care as something that it needs to be exchanged in the market, and indeed more broadly the definition and regulation of working time, which means that people prioritise and have to prioritise paid employment over other forms of care and other ways in which they might spend their time. How am I doing for time? Okay. So final thought, which arises from something that I've been writing recently, which used the framework of caring as a new social risk. So sometimes welfare scholars have talked about the different risks that welfare attempts to mitigate, whether that's the risk of unemployment, the risk of ill health, retirement, and so forth. And caring is sometimes termed as a new social risk. Thinking about that through Hartley's analytical lens, it struck me that that was really quite the wrong way round, and that it wasn't that caring itself was a social risk. Caring itself, as we've heard, is intrinsically human and indeed part of our purpose as a people and as a species. So the risk is not, or shouldn't be, seen as the risk that we will need to provide care. That's inherent to what we're doing. The risk is that we're prevented from providing care, or indeed from receiving care, when we want to and need to. And why are we prevented from doing so? We're prevented by our overly rigid employment, by the fact that care itself is not valued because it's not marketized, and because we can't get the support that we need from broader social rights and social services. So the obstacles to sociality are enormous and are not aided by some of the analytical frameworks that we use, as opposed to the starting point that Hartley gives us. It's also the case that these obstacles to practicing sociality, for living sociality, are very unevenly distributed. So it's easy enough, perhaps, for a professional to exercise the degree of autonomy over their working life, to combine their caring responsibilities with paid work, but much harder if you're subject to the kind of flexibility that delivery workers, or indeed care workers themselves, are subject to. So redesigning our welfare state, redesigning our economy in order to preserve and support relationships, support sociality, support living out the sociality that is, I agree with Hartley, entirely inherent to us as humans, is going to require some very radical redesigns indeed. This is not a trivial endeavour, but I'm absolutely delighted to have had Hartley's stimulus to encourage us all to think along those lines. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya.
Hello, can everyone hear? I wanted to pick up, obviously, on what Hartley and Tanya had said, and you've heard several times that Hartley had been a frontline welfare worker. You might have guessed that that was at Brixton Advice Centre, where I went on to be a trustee and the chair of the Board of Trustees. And he also, I think, concluded with that point of wondering if the people that the organisation had helped, that his 12 years on the ground had sort of introduced into the world, had been able to take that forward. And I sort of wanted to pick up with that hopeful point, in that I originally came to know Brixton Advice Centre because I was homeless and I was directed there for support with that. They helped me with that, and I have lived in Brixton for 20 years. And then maybe about 10 years ago, in some other community engagement I was doing, happened to turn up at Brixton Advice Centre, having trained along the way as a welfare rights advisor, because when I'd been homeless, I didn't know where you find that information. It was that idea of the informal and the sort of voluntary not quite matching up, and it being confusing, perhaps, you know, needing Tanya's circles. And our director said, oh, well, you like really minute details of quite boring meetings. Would you like to be a trustee? And I said yes, and stayed for 9 years and became chair. And I met Hartley in researching the history of the centre right back to when he had started it. I know he didn't technically start it, but really it got going with Hartley. And he invented this hybrid model of it being about care, about legal rights, and about all of the things that it requires to be able to function and survive. And it is the only advice centre of its kind to remain in Brixton. And I opened it up in the summer as part of Open House Festival, thinking, oh, 6 people will turn up. 2 of them will be Hartley and Pam, and the others might just be walking past. We had about 300 people came over that weekend, and most of them knew of the impact it had had in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. And they talked about what it had encouraged them to do. They hadn't all gone on to be trustees and benefits advisors, but they'd set up community organizations in their housing estate. They were members of the Dominoes Club. They had brought these ideas of sociality together because sitting in that reception or in the queue outside, they had met and seen other people like themselves. And what I found interesting, having done all of this work in a very non-academic way, but a more sort of lived way, was that Hartley's book put it into concepts. I was like, oh, that's got a word. Like, you can shorten that down. God, those meetings I was chairing could have been a lot shorter if I'd known those words. But that they have this powerfulness to take people forward, but that also I went back, I think I was saying to some of you before this, and read Hartley's reports of the annual reports of when the organization started. And you see the origins of what's in this book now, in his writing, in his thinking. And yes, there is an unsolvability in what you can do at grassroots because you're at the dependence of the economy, the changes in rules, regulations, papers that don't talk to people who actually need the things. But you can see the thread. And Brixton Advice Centre has been going since 1966, and it continues to have this impact. And we had people who came along who had just graduated, who'd just written a thesis based on some of that work. So, you know, it is having that effect. But what we were held back by was probably the more regulation of the charity sector. In Hartley's day, it was a little bit different. The trustees and volunteers had different legal roles. So now we have a room full of people who don't know each other, except that they're all on a trustee board. And they have legal obligations, and they need to come together in a form of solidarity to first decide what the charity does, then what the charity does in the community without dictating what the community needs or wants, but respond to it, and then to react to what's being sort of imposed on it. And we did immigration, legal aid, until they scrapped that for a lot of things. We did housing, and we continued some of the legacy of the early days of changing case law and continuing to sort of give people that sense of you can try and make things change. And something that was unique, and that's something Hartley and I talked about that sort of inspired this joining of the panel for me, was that when Hartley was at Brixton Advice Centre, it was 165. Was it? No, it was 167. I always get this wrong. Railton Road. And next door was 165, which was the Race Today Collective, which was Darcus Howe, Linton Kwesi Johnson, and had evolved out of the British Black Panther movement. And they were very opposite, but there were these huge overlaps. And in looking, I started to sort of see the ways that both of them essentially took, I mean, you've quoted extensively Marx, but it all comes back to C.L.R. James on that building. He lived and died there towards the end of his life as a great Marxist scholar, and got the first blue plaque to a Black man in Lambeth, definitely. We believe London, and we think the United Kingdom. And what came out of that was two of his quotes that I'd like to finish on. One that Linton Kwesi Johnson quoted recently in an exhibition that's on at the Black Cultural Archives. Every cook can go govern. You can go and set up your self-organization and your activity. So you can be a benefits advisor if that's what you want to do, or you can set up a radical Marxist collective. And the other is that small organization grounded in everyday life underpins everything. It underpins the Advice Centre, Race Today, the Circles, and Hartley's book and his theories. And you see the very different ways that the sociality applies across, even when it was a bunch of people sitting in a room who had nothing in common. And I recently realized that after 9 years of being there, I had a little bit like Hartley, slightly burned out on what can I do? And I chose to step down because hitting a brick wall makes you less useful. But for me to step down and discover there was a word for the things I had been doing meant that I feel like I can take that rest, that care, and do something else in the future. Otherwise, you just get stuck. And then you can't express what it is that people might need to hear. So I just wanted to show that Hartley hasn't just rewritten and revised his book, it's his entire career. And I just think that that's absolutely incredible. And thank you, because that has made an enormous change to my life and to countless other people, thousands still in Brixton. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. So we've got a good amount of time to take questions, but while you're gathering your thoughts, is there anything you wanted to respond to before we pick up any questions?
Well, I'll say now what I would otherwise have concluded with. The important thing is to say thank you both to Tanya and to Vicky for both what I consider contributions, but also, for those kind words, which I was not expecting this to turn into some sort of tribute, rather than a focus on a piece of work.
Okay, so we can take questions from the floor. I meant to check this before. I don't think we have to have do we need to have a microphone? Or we do have it. Okay, I think probably that would be good to make it easier to hear. Can you maybe introduce yourself before you ask your question?
Thanks very much. My name is Coldo Castle. I'm a senior lecturer in human rights at the University of Essex. Thanks very much for the presentation and also for the very powerful responses. Last year, I published a paper with a colleague called, her name is Marian Sander, and the argument made in the paper is along the lines of what I hear on the book. The paper is called Solidarity as Foundation of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And some people liked the paper, some people didn't like it. The ones who didn't like it much asked or made a point that I struggle with and I don't know how to answer. So I like to ask the same question or the same point that they made to me in case you have a better answer than my own. And the critique was this. They said the moment you ground social rights in a collective, in a sociality, in solidarity, in a community, you have to start drawing a line, a geographical line, or a human line between who is inside and who is outside that community, that society. So in geographical terms, that will make us reflect about whether we have the same duties or bonds to one another in Brixton and in London as a whole, or in Brixton and in the UK as a whole, or in Brixton and in the world as a whole. Based on what criteria will we divide my duties to one another in Brixton vis-a-vis or in comparison with my duties to one another between London and Tokyo? And the moral reason to draw that line is not so intuitive. And the other one is the insider and outsider in terms of humans. We may be in the same place, But some people may have just arrived because they are migrants or refugees. Some people were born here and live here for 60 years. Is that a good enough reason to draw a line between who is inside and who is outside the community? And I struggle with these two questions, I have to admit, and I wonder whether the panel has better answers than mine. Thank you.
Right, I shall proceed. Can I just firstly say, as a result of what I've said about my sort of present difficulties, sometimes the thoughts that are going through my head aren't that clearly expressed when they come out of my mouth. There is some sort of disconnection. I've had a sort of range of little cribs written here that might actually help me, but I realize I'm not really going to be able to dwell on those. But quite fundamentally, the part of my argument was that that idea of moving beyond Charles Darwin's artificial boundaries, the boundaries between insiders and outsiders, when it comes to our understanding of social rights. Because yes, we relate to each other through love in our intimate relationships. We can relate to neighbors and colleagues through what we call solidarity. But when it comes to the outsiders, the distant strangers, that is precisely where the rights come into play and where social rights actually matter. And I've gone over, the history, pointing, for example, to the various religions in their various ways, which who teach what would have been the secular equivalent of Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. Do unto others as you would have done unto you. But this was somehow enforced, if you like, through the way in which various churches and religions have sought that people should be charitable, they should do good deeds in order to save their souls, or whatever it may actually be. That's what I was trying to capture through resurrecting and reconstituting notions of sort of fetishism. And it is how one moves one's perception beyond that idea so that one can actually accept that as a human species, we are indeed all responsible for each other. And the relationship between rights and responsibilities is something that, if you care to reflect particularly not just on chapters 1 and 11, but chapter 5 deals with some of these sort of fundamental sort of ethical questions about what responsibility one has to distant strangers. And there's a little illustration in there that I give. You'll find throughout the book there are various little boxes with maybe tell a little story here or there. But there's an actual true story there from a friend of mine who isn't actually present today, so I can sell it anyway. But the idea of accidental responsibility. Now, if you can imagine this friend of mine having a walk on Peckham Rye Park, if anybody knows Peckham. In the middle, there's a strange little pond with a little fence around it. And he came around the corner, there it was, and in the pond was a child, a little boy of about 6 or 7, face down, still in the water. Now, that child had irresponsibly climbed over the fence to get there. Its parents were nowhere there, these irresponsible parents letting this child loose in a dangerous environment. So where do rights and responsibilities come into this? I think most people would agree that my friend should have done exactly what he did. Was he, at the risk of doing no more than getting his feet wet, he was able to save that child, which he did. And okay, that was, if you might like to think of as an accidental responsibility in a very particular context. Why should my friend have actually chosen to do that? Well, if we have responsibility to distant strangers, whose circumstances may in part be their own fault, people who are very different to us, how is it that we cannot have accidental responsibilities? Now, once you start talking about social rights, and what we've been able to do within nation states is to construct certain nations, welfare states, which can do that for us, where our responsibility can be visited by conscientiously paying our taxes. Increasingly in the world of sort of populist authoritarianism that we seem to be visiting at the moment. The drive is to say, no, we don't want to pay taxes towards these things. But if one accepts this concept that we have a shared responsibility for those beyond our boundaries, the boundaries that you are actually talking about, then you get the point of what social rights are actually about. It is about how we realize our rights in relation to other people, but also the legitimate claims that other people can make upon us, whether or not we have a direct responsibility. Now, that's what I'm trying to capture in terms of reconceptualizing social rights, which takes us beyond. I mean, I'd discovered I had that passage that I paraphrased from Charles Darwin's Definition of the Artificial Boundaries.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, I understand.
Local politician.
Collodion player.
The panel mentioned about social care when we can afford it. Mentioned that. With the changing demographics, with the plummeting birth rate, I think that is only going to get more challenging. And the social rights, which fail to me, I'm not academic, it feels like a man-made which is a great idea, but are they fundamentally at odds with the other man-made concept, which is capitalism, and are they really more aligned with the sort of systems we have in post-revolutionary Cuba?
Yeah, I suspect that Tanya may like to come in on that, but a couple of points. Yes, social rights are socially constructed. They are, if you like, negotiated, and they have been negotiated in the sense that you could go back to sort of Stone Age economics and the way in which early human societies managed to organize. And I pointed to the ways in which some of that could have been legitimated and understood by the participants. But as all the points that Tanya might like to come back on, in the way in which some of the basic caring functions that are essential to social functioning have become commodified in various ways, which is your point about capitalism. And I would say that you're quite right, that there is a fundamental tension in capitalism, particularly in the highly developed form of capitalism. And we move into a new age of AI and all the rest of it with all those complexities in terms of understanding where care will actually lie and will rest. And I think
Tanya has much more sort of immediate practical research, looking into and considering those actual issues. But
we humans have always been negotiating the way in which we actually organize care. And under whichever economic system it is a question for better or for worse, how that actually gets managed and how the persistent contradictions conceal perhaps our understanding of what is essential to human relationships and how that might change and how it might
conceivably evolve in the future.
Cuba is a very particular example and in the sense that here you have a very small island, which per head of population has more doctors
than anywhere else in the world.
Where they have had significant advances in terms of the developing various pharmaceuticals, not achieved in other countries, but who, as a result of geopolitical forces, is
persistently
subjugated,
so as to
minimize its capacity to realize the potential for social rights upon which they had initially begun. That is boldly simplified, But in terms of to go to the point that I have been arguing, that I would suggest, if you're going to tease that one apart,
I'd suggest that's
my starting
Tanya, Nikki, do you want to contribute anything?
Come in very briefly. Thanks. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I mean, this spectre of demographic change has haunted these discussions for some time, and it's also used, of course, to frighten us into giving up our pension rights and so on and so forth. But I think it might well constitute one of these fetishes that Hartley was talking about. Of course, it's perfectly true what you say about the changing age structure of the population, but that does not translate directly into a necessary increase in expenditure on social care, for example. And the reason I say that is that, firstly, half of our current spending on adult social care is on people of working age, not people over 60 or 65. So these are people with mental health difficulties, people with learning disabilities, and there's a great deal more that we can do in order to improve lives and prevent mental illness, to reduce that part of the cost of social care. But even amongst those older people that you mentioned, increasing share of the population, the gradient by social class or by household income in the proportion of the age group that needs additional help, needs additional care, is very steep indeed. So that, for example, somebody who is in the top fifth of the income distribution only develops, on average, the level of need at the age of 85 that someone in the bottom of the income distribution already has by the age of 60 or 65. So tackling economic inequality would be an effective solution to reducing the cost of long-term care, of social care, even in the light of our aging population.
Any other questions? Polly.
Thank you. Polly Vizard from the Centre of Analysis of Social Exclusion. Thanks, Hartley, for a really stimulating talk, and also Tanya and Nikki. I had the pleasure of teaching on Hartley's lecture course for many years, social rights and human welfare lecture course, and I noticed a certain resemblance between the chapter list that Sociality has and the lecture course, and I'm really looking forward just to reading the details of the book and finding out more about your updated conceptualization and the real shift in your thinking from negotiated needs to sociality and what exactly that entails. I'm wondering now, given your emphasis on what you've called methodological humanism, how your approach and analysis addresses legal social rights as a policy agenda in the UK at the moment. And I'm thinking particularly of Gordon Brown's proposals for constitutional protection of social rights that he put forward a couple of years ago, particularly for education, social security, housing, and healthcare, which he proposed that existing social rights that are already protected in the welfare state be protected through constitutional means. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, and particularly I'm thinking, well, Gordon Brown argued the main purpose would be to stop those rights being taken away. And I think on your 2015 interpretation, we could think of rights of that type as improving people's negotiating power and the kind of struggle to transform needs into rights. But there are certain disadvantages, and social care is not recognised as a right under Gordon Brown's proposals. And also there's kind of risk of rights that we already have in the welfare state being eroded to legal minimum standards. So I'm just really wondering where you are in your thinking about legal rights and social rights and enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you, Polly. So constitutional protection of social rights.
That is potentially one road to go down. I think what I'm seeking to point to is that there are a variety of
strategies that may actually be pursued. And what I'm still
thinking about in trying to capture what the concept of methodological humanism might actually entail is that if one can indeed start
from that sort of notion of species awareness, which maybe shifts one away from a concentration on social rights of citizenship. In terms of priorities, and anything here must in reality be strategic. Yes, there are some fundamental parts of the welfare state that we have achieved in the UK that are there to be defended, as it were, in the here and now, regardless of looking at some wider ideal. But we also know on a quotidian basis how that system was never ideal. We may look back to some halcyon age of the welfare state when it was better. But
believe me, those years at Brixton Advice Centre in the
1970s and 80s, when it was supposed to be at its height, could be pretty grim in terms of the failings of the welfare state. And its fundamental disciplinary nature in some instances. But nonetheless, there are defenses to be made. I remember one of the first bits of research that I did when I went into academia, doing a range of interviews with people living on the breadline, on Social Security. I remember one saying how he was a male lone parent, and he said, you have to recognize that when you go into that DHSS office, as it was then, said, these people are not my friends. In terms of capturing the failure of sociality in that context, that was the welfare state then. So yes, let's get on to the specifics. I mean, I have been a social policy expert. I have, taught about the exact, detail in these various areas to do with social security, education, housing, et cetera, and what policy is and perhaps how policy might be reformed. But just at this moment, I'm trying to capture that bigger picture. What kind of switch would make a difference at various levels? One, to get our understanding of social rights as something that extends beyond rights of national citizenship, or something that is framed around individualism and nationalism, and to a wider perspective. But in the immediate context, the most you can actually think in terms of immediate objectives has to do with the rights of refugees. But one could also consider what, in constitutional terms, there could be in another world if one was going to imagine no countries, no religion too. And yes, the United Nations is clearly a body out there ripe for reform, but reform under its current constitution is all but impossible. There are some brave ideas out there about a world parliament, the New Earth Federation, whatever it's called. Some, far-flung ideas. But at that level, it's, beyond individual and nation, at the global level, you have ideas, and ultimately, any meat is going to be put on the flesh of those. Any flesh is going to be put on the bones of the ideas. I do apologize. It's going to come through collaboration within civil society's organizations at the global level. One can actually see with a particular perception of our human species as a social species, a motivating force perhaps for that kind of collaboration, but probably not within the structure of the current United Nations. Something would have to change there. If you're talking down at the granular level of what happens in Brixton or wherever, it is very much down to the level of organization and reorganization. And what Vicky was trying to sort of capture was the reflection that we had in a recent conversation.
because in Brixton, there were two premises next to each other, numbers 165 and 167.
One was Brixton Advice Centre, one was Race Today. And although we knew each other, we were pals, we friendly, we didn't actually work together because one was about political organisation and one was about fighting for rights. And one thinks in retrospect how a synergy between those different approaches might have produced something with far greater degree of awareness of species identity, species awareness, that could have made a difference in terms of the granular level of a struggle for a realization of social rights. And it's at those perhaps level of those sort of relatively intangible ideas that I'm hoping to, light a spark, as it were, with the book, which could actually operate at a huge global level, down at the granular, local level, and to capture a rather different construction of social rights, which academic social policy has worked with in the past, which is based on T.H. Marshall and saying, oh, social rights, they are social constructions, yes, but we invented them with the capitalist welfare state. Well, the capitalist welfare state one is going to want to defend if it is under threat in its current form. But I mean, it was never brilliant. It had all kinds of downsides. Leave that aside. We're going to have to defend it. But what else is there going on? And I'm not some kind of prophet here, but or anything, because I cannot prophesy. But if I was going to sort of draw on the gospel according to Monty Python, I can imagine that, Brian's mum might say of me, he's not a prophet, he's just a very mischievous academic. And I'm sorry, that's, kind of where I am. I'm just trying to find a different way of conceptualizing social rights.
Fantastic. We've got just time, so let's take 2 questions to make sure that we can answer them both. So if you can introduce yourself.
Hello, thanks very much for so many fascinating talks. My name is Ruth Levin. In terms of my work, until December, Unison, and I've just started working for the Local Government Association, actually some of the people that Tanya, you talked about in relation later. Lots of really interesting. I wanted to ask Hartley, to what extent you think the new world of work, with people working increasingly isolated from home remotely. I've just started working in a new organisation. Lots of people I'll never meet in person. I'll see them on a screen. Where does that leave us? Does that challenge or does it extend the notion of sociality? Are we talking about a difference in terms of national, global communities, social contact being created? Or is it a fundamental challenge to the communities, societies, relationships that can be forged in what I think was the sort of second of the Honeth, the sort of solidarity and the communities that we create around us? And that, for example, you've talked so beautifully about in Brixton, very much place-based. Where does that leave us in terms of those place-based human interactions? And the other question was really around, we've talked quite a lot about social care, but we haven't talked at all about gender. And I wonder where you think gender and feminist analysis interlinks into these notions of care and the value that we put on care, and both how that's manifested in relation to what we as individuals and society are prepared to pay for those services, and how that maybe that's led to the state that we're in relation to care. Thank you.
2 excellent and big questions. So let's pick up the question over there. And then I think what I'll do is let you both reflect on any of those that you want to, and then come to you, Hartley, finally at the end.
My question is as much a comment, but I would love comments back on it. And it picks up from this gentleman over there and also in the back there about the legal points. And this conversation is very exciting for me because I'm a non-social policy person. I'm not an academic, but I work with NHS and communities with some of our poorest areas of the country, places like Rochdale. And what's fascinating, what is coming out, and I also founded something called Just Imagine If We Had the Best Health in the World, and reimagining health today. And we've been doing work with communities, getting people from across, so from the top CEOs right down to patients, carers, etc., to have those conversations about how could we do it differently. Let's learn from the past, but where do we go in the future? And what we have found so interesting is that the communities, they come out, if one can help them to have agency, if one can help them to wrap around, and you're clearly doing that in Brixton. And you made me smile when you said you're a mischievous academic. I thought we need more mischievous people around because there is something, and I asked Rochdale, why are you so good at what you do? Because they cut across, they get people together. And they say, well, we were the home of the co-op. We're used to working together. And so we're now working with others to help them have that muscle. But I'd be really interested because I think there's a thing from community. How do we get that into social policy and help that become from small individual to much wider?
Okay, great question. So we've got, how do we go from how do we get more community into social policy? What about gender? Where does that fit into this? And what about our new online life where we're all sitting on Zoom, maybe talking to people all around the world, creating a bigger community, or maybe losing out on community altogether? So no need to respond to any or all, but Nikki.
I'll take the point about how do we create more community. Something that I really wanted to achieve at the Advice Centre was a bit more of it being a place people could come to when they weren't in an immediate crisis. You do not get, I mean, I think this goes back a little bit to the question about constitutional. You don't really get good information out of people, I find, when they're very much in fear and crisis. They're just in survival mode. And the DHSS, the DWP, the minute you go in there, it's like, for most people, saying a policeman, you immediately feel guilty. They are out to take your benefits. So you're never going to get answers from that aren't just, what are you not going to punish me for? So I wanted to make the space that we had somewhere that people could come. That was why I opened it up, so that there was also not the stigma of being seen to go in. That's still a really huge issue. You know, we've been through the era of austerity where we heard how benefit claimants were talked about, and I was on benefits at the time. And I heard other trustees talk about benefit claimants while being one at a benefits advice centre in a way that I was like, I'm sorry, are you aware what room you are in? This is awkward. But what I do in my community engagement elsewhere is use a particular topic. There are some things that tend to unite people. Food. So I actually write cookbooks because, of course, just have the weirdest career ever. And I worked for Lewisham Council for a while, and we used to set up a food market. We had a vegan market because that cut across kosher, halal, ITAL. And it meant that people could come out and talk about food and find what overlapped. But what we were actually there was to talk about the master planning of the new affordable stroke, social stroke, we're going to redevelop your housing. But while they were eating, they start telling you about their community and what they need and what they want. And you get this really valuable information, and it is mischievous. And we'd have the equivalent of, you know, face painting, but people swapping recipes. And then they discover things and they feel that that space is safe. And also what we did was we took it out of civic buildings and we took it out of anywhere that might intimidate someone who didn't feel those places were for them. And I think it's quite notable that the only time I have ever been asked about my experience of spending quite a lot of my adult life on benefits is here, which is because I've done something that's really quite unusual of being on benefits and being this trustee. And the fact that nobody actually asks. There is, strangely, with your choice, there's no feedback form. Like, you're asked to choose what GP you want, NHS, when you're disabled and have health conditions like I do, but then they don't actually want to hear how the experience was for you. They want to tell you how it was for you. And it is a touch of, across all of those aspects, the patient is sort of interfering with the nice, orderly running of the ward. And I think we have to get away from that because we've just found new ways of doing that. And therefore, all of the information is closed off in people who think, well, you don't want to hear what I have to say.
Thank you. Tanya. Yeah, I'll just pick up on a couple of points. Thank you for the question about how does gender play into the undervaluing of care. And I think that's absolutely right, both, of course, for paid carers who are underpaid and for the unpaid carers, again, predominantly, although by no means exclusively women, whose efforts are often under-recognised or not recognised at all. So the whole kind of agenda of valuing care, I feel, crosses over both the unpaid and currently paid parts of that spectrum. And I think there's an event here at LSE celebrating the Wages for Housework campaign in a couple of weeks. So of course, it's not just housework, but it's care work as well that fits into that. And just a comment also briefly on the very interesting contribution from Rochdale, and be lovely to talk to you a little bit if we have a chance after, because Rochdale's also a part of a project that Polly Vizard and I are involved in on the looking at children's information. But more generally, I think, and wanting to make my last remark a hopeful remark, there is movement within academic social policy to incorporate more participatory methods, so methods that do draw directly on people's lived experience and giving agency to people who previously would have been the subjects of research rather than the agents of research. And I see that across the board in our subject, in our discipline. So I think there are opening up more routes for connection between community organising and academic social policy, which I regard as a very positive development.
Yes, some huge areas. Ruth, on the new world of work, I made the point in sort of discussing that
notion of sociality and how dependent that as a defining characteristic, if you want, an essential of the human species, is everything is sort of interconnected. And so that sociality is connected with work if you're to understand work very differently. And certainly quite a lot of my sort of earlier academic work has focused on, am I fading sound-wise? I see Bill's having trouble with it. It's focus. It's focus. I did quite a lot of work around welfare to work and the sort of disciplinary regimes that were being introduced around benefits claimants, not just in this country, but pretty widely throughout the developed world, the global north, as it were.
And there's quite a volume of scholarship around that. But I was one of those who was arguing, going back to Marx, that what we need to do is to reconstruct our understanding of what work is. Work is about more than wage labor. Work is about creative, productive human activity, which may or may not depend on wage labor. It is precisely because the commodification of labor power that it creates a particular context in which we struggle. And the changes in that context, you're absolutely right, are critical to what the future might hold, because the way in which resistance to that has taken the route that has been taken to have some degree of resistance has been around the organization of wage laborers. And increasingly, the capacity to do that is changed by the various ways in which work is actually being reorganized, in which the association between workers can actually take place. And it is at the point where you actually have that shift in perception and to actually say, however we sustain ourselves as human beings in terms of the resources that the distribution of resources, the distribution of care on which we depend, let's re-understand what work is. So care, in terms of the care that is provided for vulnerable people and for children, for God's sake, that is work. Let us actually understand that. There are all sorts of things that we do. So much of the welfare state is now being supported by unpaid volunteers. What they do is work. Do you regard what politicians do as work, all the political activity that goes into campaigning for changes in the welfare state, often done by volunteers? Is this something that they do in their spare time, not to be regarded as work? Let us reconceptualize work when we actually understand the changing conditions that are affecting one bit of the world of work, which has to do with labor markets and the technologies that shape those. So connect that into what I'm saying, and I'm talking about this airy-fairy sort of profit vision stuff. But nonetheless, a shift in perception can make a change in practice. The Gestalt switch is, perception is an active process. A change in perception is an a mental act, which then can be reflected in changes in practice and policy. Now, similarly, I won't go on as long as far as gender. Yes, of course, I mean, that is essential, once again, to any discussion of care. And much of what has driven my understanding has been work by feminists on, the ethic of care. And some of the stuff in the book actually deals with that in terms of the sort of ethics and ideology around sociality and how, shifts in that can take place. But in terms of redefining our ethics around care and a new sort of axiology of care in terms of how we understand would go to the heart of some critical gender questions. On the whole issue, if you like, of community and community organization, I make these references and stuff that still interests me, work that has largely come through not social policy, but social development work and observing activities in the global south in several different countries, which has sometimes been referred to as insurgent citizenship. The idea of sort of fairly anarchistic forms of organizations where communities have reorganized partly through strategic campaigning, but partly through doing loads of stuff themselves. And so at that very other level, which is far from a grossly intellectualized sort of global picture, but down to what people do in terms of making a difference, how they actually organize the ways in which we care and care for and about each other.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hartley. This has been a really thought-provoking and an uplifting, I think, discussion. And there's been a clink of glasses at the back of the room, which tells us that we can carry on our discussion over drinks. So it just falls to me to say some thank yous. Thank you to Maria and Pippa for all their work to get this event organised. And thank you very much to you, the audience, for coming out tonight and for such excellent questions. And of course, finally, and most importantly, thank you very much to our panel, Nikki, Tanya, and of course, Hartley.